Hello there, buyers or sellers of a residential transaction. If you are confused about all of the dates that are involved when transacting a residential property, today we're going to deep dive into the most important dates that you need to know. Stick around for the whole video and I'll also explain to you a lot of the conditions and what they mean when involving yourself in a residential transaction. There are 3 dates that are considered the most important milestones when transacting in a residential transaction. The very first date is known as the acceptance date. This is also known as an effective date. This is the date that a buyer offers an offer to a seller and the seller accepts that offer. When all signatures are obtained on that offer, you are essentially under agreement. This is the very first date that starts the entire process of the transaction. This is known as the acceptance date, or more specifically, the effective date. Now, the second date that's a milestone during that process of a residential transaction is known as a firm date. The firm date is the date in which the deadline is needed to be met for a buyer to satisfy all of the conditions that they've outlined are part of the transaction. Now, I'm going to spend some time breaking down a lot of the most common conditions that you see in an offer on an agreement of purchase and sale that is presented to the seller. I'll also touch on some of the ones that you don't see as often, but that you probably would want to know about in case they do come up. And then the very last date that I'm going to share with you guys is the close date. The close date is essentially the date that the money is exchanged hands from a buyer to a seller and keys are provided from a seller to a buyer, effectively making that person the new owner of a home. So let's jump into it. Effective date. The effective date, like I've already mentioned, is the date that an offer is made to a seller from a buyer and the seller accepts that offer. All signatures are captured on the agreement of purchase and sale and you are essentially under contract, and that contract is now legal binding agreement. The things that can happen between the first milestone, which I'm talking about is the effective date, and the second milestone, which is the firm date, these are all the conditions that a buyer has outlined is important and part of the transaction. So some of the more common conditions that you'll see that need to take place during that period from an effective date to a firm date are as follows. Deposit amount. So deposit is the amount of money that a buyer has agreed or suggested that they will put forward towards that house. The condition, or rather the deposit, consists of 2 pieces. It consists of an amount and it consists of a date in which it's due. Now, the deposit date will always fall between the effective date after an offer is accepted and somewhere towards the firm date. Most times you'll see it 5, maybe 7 days after an offer is accepted. But then there are times as well that a buyer might not want to provide a deposit until the actual firm date. Another example or condition that you often see with transactions are an inspection. This is a really big condition and it is probably one of the more common conditions that you see in an offer. An inspection is exactly what it sounds like. It is when a buyer is sourcing and finding an inspector to inspect the house. Essentially, they're going to walk all floors inside the house, in the attic, in the basement, any crawl spaces that it has, and they give a report card of the house. Now, with an inspection, something to understand as a buyer, there is no pass or fail on an inspection. It is exactly a report. It basically outlines all of the potential issues that an inspector has captured during that inspection. A lot of times, that inspection and those things that come up, sometimes a seller may not even know that there was things that the house had issues of. Maybe there's a substantial amount of mold in the attic and those homeowners have not been in the attic for years and years and years. Maybe there's cracks in the foundation that they just haven't been aware of, haven't been to the basement. But essentially an inspection is understanding really well what state the home is in. In a seller's market, like the one we've been in the last few years, you actually might see some offers come in without an inspection. The reason that you might see that is when there's competitive offers and multiple offers on a home, it can make that offer more attractive to a seller. Now, as an agent, I almost always encourage my buyers to have a inspection condition on their offer. It's very important that they do because, again, they're protecting themselves against any defects that they were not made aware of or couldn't see when they walked the house during the showing. There are very few times that you might see an offer come through without an inspection, but again, that's generally in a very competitive market, a seller's market, multiple offer situations, in which case a buyer might choose not to have that in there. I don't recommend it, generally speaking, particularly for first-time home buyers or someone's not savvy within the process or that industry. If they're an inspector and they're buying the home, they might feel comfortable to not have an inspection on that because maybe on their showing, they took the time to look at the things that are most important to them and they feel comfortable about that without that condition. Another really popular common condition is finance. Finance is essentially saying, Mr. or Mrs. Seller, I need to ensure that I will be able to get the lending or the borrowing of the funds for me to afford this house and the mortgage payments that are going to come for the next 25 or 30 years. Finances are really important to understand. And again, this is something that we almost always see on an offer, particularly in residential single-family home transactions. In a seller's market like the one we've had the last few years, there are circumstances or situations where the buyer chooses not to have a finance condition. I know I've had listings where I've received offers that did not have a finance condition on there, and I have had buyers that have also offered without a finance condition. I don't often recommend it. In those situations, those individuals are incredibly cash healthy. Their finances are not something that they would bat their lashes at. They know for a fact that those funds are there in the bank, staring them in the face, and that they can part ways with that without worrying about it. The finance condition is important, and how it works is a broker will connect the buyer with a lender, and the lender will actually look at all of the credit information, financial history, and current financial status of a buyer. They determine how much income that person is making, they determine how much debt they have, and they come up with a ratio that determines whether they can or can't afford a home. Essentially, a finance condition is oftentimes what doesn't allow a home to continue through that process when a buyer actually can't afford to purchase a particular home. Another really common condition that you might see in there is subject to review of property disclosure statement, which this is a simple 3-page document that a seller provides a buyer, which outlines all of the information that they best know to the best of their knowledge may or may not be wrong with the house. It comments on the electrical work, it comments on the plumbing, it touches on zoning, and it touches on any work that might have been done to the home under the seller's supervision. This 3-page document is essentially the seller saying, to the best of our knowledge, this is the status of our house, particularly since we've owned it, and to the best of our ability and knowledge, these are the things that A, we've done or changed, B, may or may not had problems with. Other documents are also reviewed, which brings me to another condition, which is known as the lawyer review. Now, lawyer review isn't essentially a condition per se. It doesn't fall in the same section as all the other conditions. It has its own section. But what a lawyer review is essentially is a lawyer will first and foremost look to make sure that all the agreements, the purchase and sale agreements, any schedules or documents that collectively form the agreement that both parties are now under are done correctly, that all the T's are crossed, all the I's are dotted, that the dates make sense, and that there's no errors in spelling of the owners, and that the dates align with what is supposed to happen or what makes sense. Probably more importantly though, a lawyer will also review what's called a title search, and they review that. So they also look to make sure that the seller is in fact the owner of the house, that they do have the deed in their name, and that they're legally allowed to actually sell it. It's not mom's, it's not dad's, it's not anybody else's that doesn't match who is on the deed. The lawyer will also look and make sure that there aren't any liens or debts against the house. That's really important because when a buyer is buying or purchasing the property, those debts and liens will impact whether they will be carried over to the buyer or if it's even legally allowed to be sold or transacted, depending on how severe the lien or the debt is. those are the big priorities that a lawyer will look at, and a lawyer review is essentially critical and on every agreement of purchase and sale, at least the ones that I've experienced. Some other examples that you might see are homeowners association approval. So in certain neighborhoods, you might be in part of a homeowners association, where the homeowners association is a governing body of a particular neighborhood, where they have rules and regulations of what you can and can't do with that particular transaction. There might be certain stipulations or rules that you need to abide by as a owner of the home. And that is something that you may be looking at part of your conditions when offering on a home. Insurance is another one, making sure that an insurer will actually insure the house. So taking the time in that period, again, all of this between the acceptance date and the firm date, where all of these things may take place depending on if they found themselves on the agreement of purchase and sale. Those are some of the conditions that you'll find or may find between the effective date or the acceptance date and the firm date. Now, you'll notice that I haven't given specific dates on those because they really do depend on what was agreed upon in the offer. Those dates are completely open to the buyer offering on the seller, although most times a buyer will try and adhere to a seller's preferences in that time frame. There is no hard set stone in terms of how long that takes, but a general rule of thumb, or what you typically see, is for a deposit generally about 5 days after an effective date. And all the other conditions or the firm date are generally between 10 and 15 days from the effective date. So they have, we'll say, 2 weeks to get an inspector, have them come in, inspect the house, review the report, and make any decisions. Have the insurance lined up, making sure that they can in fact insure the home, that they would have provided a deposit in that time frame. And every other finance and other conditions that you have all have to be taken care of between the effective date and, of course, the firm date. Another thing that might happen in that period between effective date and firm date is an appraisal review. So sometimes what a lender will do is send an appraiser to go look at the home that's being purchased. And the intention is to determine, is the house actually worth what it's being bought for? I'll tell you why that's important, and I'll also share with you when that might happen. So the reason that's important is because a lender is lending money not out of the kindness of their heart, but because they're making money on that money. They are not going to take any unnecessary risk when loaning money to anybody at all. And so essentially, they would send potentially an appraiser to look at that house to ensure that they're going to get, or that the house is valued at least what that buyer is buying it for. So should that buyer not be able to fulfill their commitments and default on the mortgage payments at any time down the road, and are in a position to potentially lose that house, that the bank or whoever the lender was will have an asset that's worth at least what they lent out to the buyer. Anything more than that, or a discrepancy between what it's worth and what they're lending, would obviously cost them money in the long run, and that's exactly why sometimes they send an appraiser. Okay, and then the final date, the third date, is the closing date. So the closing date is the last day that was already agreed upon at the very beginning of this, that would have been submitted on the agreement of purchase and sale on the effective date, which is essentially the day that the buyer communicates to their lawyer that everything is satisfied, they have had a final walkthrough, the house is still in the same condition that it was in when they saw it during the showing, and perhaps when they visited during an inspection, or any time between that period of the start to where they are now, and that they're satisfied with everything. The lawyer will then receive that communication and release the funds from the buyer's lawyer or held in trust to the seller's lawyer or somewhere held in trust, in which case the seller then releases the keys to the buyer, effectively making the buyer the new homeowner. So to recap, because I know that was a lot of conversation and talk, the 3 prime dates and milestones in a transaction. Number 1, the effective date. This is the date the offer is accepted and that you're now under contract. Number 2 is the firm date. The firm date is the deadline to achieve and satisfy all of the conditions that you might have outlined in the agreement of purchase and sale, and effectively making the house sold and allowing the agent to put the sold sign on the home. And then the third date is the closing date. This is the date that money is exchanged, keys are exchanged, title and deed are exchanged, and the buyer is now the homeowner. Guys, my name's Peter Garonis. I'm an entrepreneur, licensed realtor, property manager, owner, and what I do in part is I collect information and ideas from people that are smarter than me, from people that are more experienced than I am, from reading the books like the ones you see over my shoulder, and sharing that information with all of you in hopes of getting you somewhere along the line in an upward trajectory from where you are to where you want to be. Signing off. Thanks for listening.